Turn your mic on.
Director Canada,
Here.
Director Heckerman.
Here.
Director Prida,
Here.
Vice Chairmember Chides,
Here.
Chairmember Schultz,
Here.
Deputy Quorum.
Oral communications, items on the agenda. Anyone like to speak? On new business, conduct workshop and discuss potential financing and refinancing relating to 1993 RDA tax bonds.
Madam Chairman and members of the board, we had set in place a potential refinancing of the redevelopment bonds for 1993. The various members have been meeting related to this, and tonight what we're doing is going to give you a summarization of the discoveries of what we can do and make some recommendations to you. And if you have any comments or questions, we will go forward there. The financial advisor is here, and that is Sarah Oberle. She'll be making the presentation. We also have Andy Hall, who is our bond counsel, and then John Kavanaugh has been involved, and so has Ernesto in these as well. So I'll let Sarah make the presentation. And Jim Chilton is planning on being here. He may be just a couple of minutes late. He's flying in from the Bay Area.
Thank you very much for inviting us here today. We heard that. What I'd like to do is start by introducing the team members that have been involved in the financing to date, and then walk you through what we've done so far to develop a financing plan for the tax allocation bonds that are proposed to be issued this year. As Michael said, my name is Sarah Oberle. I'm with the firm of Stone & Youngberg. We're serving as financial advisor to the redevelopment agency, to the city in this offering. We also have with us here today Andy Hall from the firm of Jones Hall, who you've used for several of your bond financings, including the 1993 bonds that are being proposed to be refunded. In addition, obviously, we have agency counsel, and the underwriter, Jim Chilton, as Michael said, will be here later on to answer any questions. Underwriters counsel, who isn't present today, is the firm of Lewis Brisbois, and then the fiscal consultant, who's instrumental in looking at your tax revenues today and projecting your tax increments tomorrow and throughout. That person will be very involved in the rating agency and the credit review process that will be coming after we set the parameters of the financing. Okay. When, as I said, we're hired as financial advisor to the agency, and when Michael came to us back in October, he said, here's a opportunity to refinance the 1993 bonds. It was a kind of launched by a proposal from Jim Chilton for the refinancing only. And, Michael very wisely observed, this is great. There's meaningful, net present value savings. But how do we really optimize this financing for the redevelopment agency's benefit? And so Stone & Youngberg was engaged to really look at the alternatives that are out there and develop a financing plan for this bond issue that may or may not include an issuance of new money. And looking at the refunding, how do you structure that to really optimize a new money portion if there is to be one? So launching into a development a financing plan, we looked at certain parameters that are really framework for developing the plan. And to begin with, we looked at what are the agency's goals. What's the credit environment that you're operating in? What's the legal environment you're operating in? And then just what's reality as far as the agency's finances. And those are really the walls to really form the financing plan. So let me start with the agency's articulated goals. Like I said, realize meaningful net present value savings. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, the 1993 bonds are out at interest rates of 6.35% is the long bond. So that's clearly above where market interest rates are today. There is going to be, just a standalone, plain vanilla refunding of the bonds will generate meaningful savings. But in doing that, we wanted to create a financing structure that really leveraged the capacity of the tax increment stream. So creating capacity for additional projects. And really what I mean there, the 1993 bonds really took advantage of a piece of law that allowed those bonds to be issued for a 40-year time period. That's 10 years beyond the time period for the agency to repay any new money borrowing that it would issue today. So the agency or the project area loses its ability to repay bonded indebtedness after December 1st, 2023. These refunding bonds go out to December 1st, 2033. So in doing the refunding, if we can push the amortization of those bonds out to the years between 23 and 33, that creates capacity in the front end. So you're basically realizing your savings in the front end between now and 2023. The other articulated goal of the agency was to really develop a sound financial structure. Clearly, the environment that redevelopment agencies live in today is different than it lived in 4 years ago when they issued the 99 bonds, and clearly, in 1993 when we issued the 1993 bonds. Clearly now the state is facing immense fiscal problems, which has, as you know, come to mean things like ERAF and filtering money from redevelopment agencies back to the city. It's very desirable in this day and age to have a prudent bond structure that takes account or assumes that you're going to continue to have money, such as ERAF payments, going out to the state. As I said, there's legal limitations that you have to live within. I talked about your time limit to repay debt. You have bonds out there, the 1999 bonds. Those have tests for additional bonds. You have to live within those tests for the additional bonds. As the financing plan describes, which is the larger, thicker document that you have in front of you, the 1999 bonds have pretty lenient additional bonds tests, much more lenient than you'd probably get away with today issuing a similar bond offering. There's a federal tax law time limitation to repay any or to spend any new money bond proceeds. You have to have a reasonable expectation that you're going to spend those proceeds within 3 years. And then there's the issue with the housing bonds and how do you spend housing bond proceeds. Again, needs to be spent within 3 years, but additionally, obviously it needs to advance your low and moderate income housing program. If it's tax exempt, then it has to act and look and feel like a grant rather than a loan. And then there's the credit environment that you live within. And I would say that you have a very good credit story to tell the credit markets. And by that I mean primarily the rating agencies and municipal bond insurers and eventually to the investors. If I were to pick out 4 primary things that the rating agencies and bond insurers look at, it's size of the project area, the taxpayer concentration, your base year value relative to your current year assessed value, and then probably how much you've grown in recent years and what happened to assessed values during the recession of the 90s. On four of those, or on three of those four fronts, you fare fairly well. The one that's lacking is something that the project area really can't do anything about, which is just the mere size of the project area, only being 1 square mile. That's fairly small relative to many other project areas that a credit analyst would be comparing it against. But on the other front, you have a low base year value relative to your current year value. I believe it's a factor of 750% increase. You've had meaningful assessed value growth over the last 6 years. It's been about 27%, which is good. You have moderate tax base concentration. I think it's very low relative to your size of the project area, but it's still about 19% of your incremental assessed value. Something like 30 is considered very high, something less than 10 is considered low, so 19 falls in that range of moderate, something to watch but not something to be too concerned with. The other thing that's really good that you have going for you is that about 67% of your incremental value is derived from residential property. Credit analysts very much like residential property over commercial property. It generally means lower tax base concentration. It's a more stable income stream. You have less coming and going and tearing down and building up. So these are all good things. Then there's also your real life constraints. Again, another of the articulated goals back from day one, Michael said, is that our redevelopment agency has been self-supportive. We pay debt service, the money goes sort of a lockbox mechanism, pays debt service, and then at the end of the year is released and used to pay for agency admin. It pays for your ERAF obligation. There's a yield reduction payment that derives from bonds many years ago. There's also some reimbursement agreement with the city regarding the Carson Boulevard acquisition project. All of those are being paid after debt service, but are still being paid out of tax increment revenue. So that the net nut after other income is about $873,000, meaning that at the end of the day, we can bond up to capacity, but you need to have enough money left over to pay for these other obligations. So those were that's sort of the framework we began with, and looked at then what is the appropriate legal structure for issuing a bond obligation. Long story short, we needed to, because of the need to validate the refunding of the 1993 bonds. I know you've all taken action on that project so far, and that just validates the fact that you can go ahead and issue those bonds with a maturity out to 2033. What we've developed is an authority bond structure where the authority bonds are going to be sold to the underwriter who sells them to investors. The authority is selling bonds that are secured by tax allocation bonds, bonds issued by the agency. So there's essentially a bond purchase agreement between the agency and the authority. The authority buys the agency bonds. That's security for bonds that are sold to the public. That structure is just a more efficient legal structure. There's more documents you're going to end up having to sign at the end of the day, but it becomes a more efficient structure to be sold to bond investors. And it really doesn't change the nature of the credit. Then looking at what's the optimal structure as far as lien level, as I mentioned, you have the 1999 bonds outstanding. Those 99 bonds are actually senior to the 1993 bonds. We could, and considered it at the start, is there a reason to keep the 2004 refunding bonds subordinate to the 1999 bonds? Well, the answer was no, none that we saw. You'd only do that if you were trying to leverage up to a higher bonding capacity, and there didn't seem to be a need, or we couldn't recommend going forward with that in that way. The 1999 bonds only had only required 10% coverage, so anything less than that would have been basically you only have $1 to pay for every $1 of debt service. Going to your coverage requirement, we kind of looked at it from starting from two different ways. First, what do you need from a credit perspective to qualify for municipal bond insurance? And then on the back side, how much do you need to have left over at the end of the day in order to make that $873,000 of non-bonded subordinate obligations? Well, quite ironically, they ended up at about the same place, which is about 25% coverage. So that means for every $1 of debt service, you need $1.25 of tax increment. And I think that's about the minimum you can hope to bond up to in order to qualify for an investment grade rating and for municipal bond insurance. And clearly that's desirable because that means interest rates that are significantly lower than you would be if you just issued rated or non-rated bonds. So what does this all mean in terms of issuing this bond? As I said clearly, there is very meaningful net present value savings from just a refunding. And so what this shows here is what if we did this bond issue just the refunding bond issue? It generates about $4 million of net present value savings, which is about 13.6% of the refunded par. Sort of 3 to 5% is considered the break even or the go forward amount of savings that's necessary. So clearly 13% is on the high end of the range. As your financial advisor, I'd recommend clearly go forward with the refunding of these bonds structured in this way. And what this does is show that what we've done is push the amortization out to the long end. So in the long end, you're only paying $2.68 million in total debt service. That's the exact same level that you're paying debt service right now. But we lowered it on the front end, so you would have an additional $270,000 of tax increment every year to either use towards debt service on a new money bond issue or to use for pay-as-you-go facilities, redevelopment projects. Okay, so we know we're doing the refunding. What about the new money? This slide shows you what debt service, filling that capacity in with debt service, that would generate or be able to secure a bond issue of about little over $4 million. It nets out about $3.5 million of new money for non-housing redevelopment projects. What does that mean on housing? The housing bonds, you also have about $330,000 of available housing set-aside tax increment to spend towards debt service on a bond issue. If you had projects to spend it on, that bond issue could generate about $3.6 million if it's a tax-exempt bond issue. It's about $3.1 million if it's a taxable bond issue. And again, if it's tax-exempt, it needs to be spent on grant-like programs rather than loan-like programs. So just concluding, where do we go from here? First of all, we still are working through the validation process, hope to receive the default judgment this week or next week. That would mean that we'd be in a position to issue bonds 30 days out from that. So we are structuring this latter end of our financing schedule to have the city council take action at about that same time and be in a position to be in the market as shortly thereafter as possible. We need decisions made on what the ultimate structure is within the next couple weeks so that we can gear up for the rating agency process and bond insurance process. So that's usually a 2-week process. We want it to end at about the same time as the city council is taking action so that as soon as action is taken, we can be in the market with a bond offering document and then out in the market with bonds. So, questions for you or decision items for you is to determine whether you have a need for non-housing new money. That's that $3.5 million of bond proceeds, tax-exempt bond proceeds. And then determine whether or not you also want new money for housing programs. And if so, whether that money qualifies for tax-exempt purposes or for taxable purposes. That concludes my presentation, and I welcome your comments and questions.
I'd like to make a couple of comments, and then I think either Andy Hall or John might address this. In my mind, obviously, the refinancing makes a lot of sense. The new projects with the non-housing money, I know we have one project that everybody would like to get going, and that's a dead-end streets, and that's $2 million, so that would take $2 million to 3.4 already. So that wouldn't be a real problem. But the housing projects, there's some real restrictions on, like for deeds and so forth. And I think you need to hear at least what the restrictions are and what kind of problems we're facing, and we may want to think about whether we want to go there or not, because I have a feeling, I'm not sure that we have anything that's really set in there to spend this money on. Plus, I will also point out at the same time, that doesn't mean you can't borrow that money in the future when you do have a project. It just means we wouldn't borrow it now. But I think either Andy or John can explain, because one of the things I learned today, there's 3 restrictions of 45 and 55 years on some of this stuff, which based on our housing market today, who wants to put their house in that kind of a situation with inflation powering these things up? But they can give you more insights into this than I can. So whichever one of you two wants to tackle it. Andy?
John pointed at me. Just briefly, trying to use your housing set-aside money can be very tricky, particularly if you're going to bond against your housing set-aside tax increment. Now, there's 2 separate sets of problems that you have to deal with. One is the state law restrictions. And over the course of time, they have become more and more onerous because the housing advocates have just been so assertive in trying to make this money that's used for low income, make sure that it is used for low income and it remains used for low income over a long period of time. For example, if you assist housing, rental housing, or single-family housing, there have to be deed restrictions on those properties. And John, I haven't looked at it lately, but I think it's 55 years for rent, for multifamily housing, 45 years for single-family housing. It used to be 15 and 10. So you can see what's happened there. That just makes your programs more difficult from a state law standpoint. It used to be that we could finance streets in low and moderate income areas, which always seemed like a proper thing to do. You can't do that anymore. It's got to be project specific. In other words, there's got to be a low and moderate income project going on that you are actually putting that infrastructure in for that project. So that's what you've got to deal with in state law, and John can keep you posted on what's going on there. To make matters worse, over in federal income tax law, they've put in a lot of restrictions, which are particularly difficult on housing projects. The normal kind of housing project is, one, you make loans for rehabilitation, or you make loans for down payment assistance. The idea being, okay, these people can get this low interest rate money, pay it back over time, and then you can recycle it. Unfortunately, you can't do that with tax-exempt bonds. Another thing you can't do with tax-exempt bonds, which is an ordinary part of programs that agencies like to do, is go out and buy houses, rehab them, and sell them at a low rate. You can't do that. Under the restrictions, you can't receive money back from bond-financed property. So what we get to is the only thing you can do under federal tax law, if there's going to be tax-exempt bonds, is to give the money away. In other words, you can go in and make grants for rehab, you can make grants for down payment, but you can't get any money back. So that's why we're seeing a lot of redevelopment agencies going to the taxable bonds. You know, you've still got the state law requirements, the 45 and 50 F5, but at least you get rid of the prohibition against making loans or buying and selling. So I think most of the housing bonds that I've done in the last year or two have had taxable housing components, along with a tax-exempt than non-housing component. Anyway, that's what Mike wanted me to explain to you as to the problems of spending the bond proceeds if you do housing projects.
I do want to point out one thing. Based on this information, to simplify it for you, if we were to borrow everything that we could borrow, our debt service payment would be basically the same as it is today. If we just borrow to refinance and for the general money for redevelopment as opposed to housing, we would have a reduction in our payments on debt service, and we'd still have $3.2 million to spend on projects, or $3 million for whatever it is, on special projects within the redevelopment agency area, you know, but that are not restricted the same way. It's the 3.7 is the restricted money, and if you don't do it within 3 years, you got to give it back or something, I guess. I don't know what happens if you don't spend it within 3 years, but you have to do everything within 3 years with that housing, and I just don't see us right now having any plans for that. And
Well, the city doesn't lend itself to do that. I mean, it's 9/10 of a square mile. We're
Right.
built out. We're dense as hell. Yeah, I don't think this council is ready to be pushing, you know, to spend money for more multi-units within this dense area. And I just can't see it. I don't see that it's a very wise thing to do.
One additional note is that the money, the pay-as-you-go money can be spent like taxable bond proceeds. So you still have the ability to do small projects as you go along, as you
Right.
have been doing. So,
That's all we got is small
Yeah.
projects.
I think
There's nowhere we could build.
we'd be farther ahead to go than the taxable. And then that way we can use it for the projects that we really need to use.
it in 3 years, forget it.
at least my recommendation, but it's just, and it is a recommendation, it would be to refinance, borrow the general money for the redevelopment agency, and go forward based on that proposition, which would, the result would be we'd have $3.2 million to spend on projects, we'd have to define it a little bit for the official statement, but I assume the dead-end project would be one of those projects. And then that takes $2 million away from, $2 million. I think Joe's budget's actually 1.9, but I rounded to 2 million. And then we'd have to find some other projects, but we can do other street improvements and things like that within
Oh,
the
yeah.
city. So that's not a problem. We can find those projects relatively easy and spend it within 3 years. We're ready to go. So that would be my recommendation, which the result would be we'd have some money to spend on the city additionally, and at the same time, we'd reduce our debt service payments.
In that 2 point whatever million dollars it is on the dead ends, was that the property purchases taken into it?
Property acquisition and construction, but depending on when we get this project done, keep in mind there'll be inflation and
Yeah.
also what comes out from the bids always ends up being different than the city engineer's estimate too, quite often.
Is Will Dan listening to this?
Yes, it's a Wildan estimate.
So at this point, what we're looking for is direction from you on what you'd like us to do, if you want more information, or if you have further questions, or for us to just go forward based on whatever your recommendation is. If you agree with mine, fine. If not, whatever your recommendation may be, we'll go forward with whatever you determine. I know you want to refinance at the minimum, so.
Yeah, we want to, I would like to I'd make a motion to refinance per your recommendation. I think that's the way to go. I think to take on any additional money and is not very feasible, and lower our debt service is very feasible, so I'm for that.
You'd want to borrow the money to do the dead-end street, the general money, just not the housing money, is that correct?
Right.
Right.
Right, that's what you're saying. I just wanted to make sure that we were on the same
Right.
page there.
Now,
Okay.
where are we going to put any houses? We don't have any property left.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure we're all where we're going, because then we'll go forward if it's
Yeah,
passed.
we'll think of what to do with the rest of the money, don't worry.
Oh, I'm sure we can figure something out.
Do we
Yeah.
have a second for Leonard?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone disagree? Nope.
I want to thank Sarah very much for making the presentation to us, and she's done absolutely a great job on getting all this information, and she's been rounding all the parties together and so forth. And I don't know if Jim Chilton wants to make any comments, but he's here, so if he does, I think we ought to let him do that since he's our underwriter.
You made it.
Thank you. It's good to see each of you. I agree totally with the financing plan and the conclusion. Thankfully, the bond market is kind of held since we started talking about this last April. And hopefully it holds for another couple of months.
There you go.
I too want to thank Sarah. Made it easy for me to understand.
Did a good job.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, is that it? Adjourn the
Anything else?
meeting to 6 PM today?
Okay.
It looks like it. Looks like some.
We're done?
Oh, and we have some goodies to eat. Come back here.